The second half of 1803 saw Napoleon once again on his travels, after 3 Paris-bound years. On the 25th of June he began an extensive northern tour lasting 2 months. First he toured the towns of northern France that would be important in the coming campaign against England: Amiens, Abbeville, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, Lille. Then he crossed the border into Belgium and proceeded through Nieuwpoort, Ostend, Bruges, Ghent and Anvers to Brussels, where he arrived on 2 July. After a 10-day sojourn there, he made his way back to St. Cloud in a leisurely itinerary that took in Maastricht, Liege, Namur, Mézières, Sedan and Reims. He arrived back in the palace on August. Throughout the late summer and autumn he seemed obsessed with the idea of a descent on England and spoke excitedly to his family about planting the French flag on the Tower of London. Very optimistic by now about his chances of bringing off a Channel crossing, he made an extended visit to Boulogne from 7 November. Absurdly overconfident of his ability to vault over the Channel and the Royal Navy, Napoleon was brought down to earth in November 803 by the first whispers of the most serious conspiracy yet against his autocracy. In the autumn of 803 several Chouans were arrested in Paris, taken before a military commission and sentenced to death. One of the condemned asked to make a statement before his death and revealed a wide-ranging plot against Napoleon. Other condemned conspirators then broke silence. It turned out that the ringleaders in the latest conspiracy were General Moreau, the hero of Hohenlinden, and General Pichegru, who had been deported after the Fructidor coup in 1797 but had since returned secretly. The plot called for the assassination of the first consul and the return of the Bourbons. A further twist came on the 29th of January 804 when one Corson, a British secret agent, was arrested. To save his life he revealed further details of the plot. There was to be a triumvirate consisting of Pichegru, Moreau and Cadoutal, the Chouan leader, which would pave the way for a Bourbon restoration. Pichegru and Cadoutal were known to be already in Paris. Fouche's deputy, Pierre Fragnois Riel, solemnly but gloatingly told Napoleon, "You've only uncovered about a quarter of this affair." Acting on Corson's information, Riel and the secret police were able to arrest several minor conspirators who, under torture, divulged the further intelligence that a Bourbon prince was privy to the plot. They did not reveal the name of the prince, but both Fouche and Talleyrand told Napoleon their sources pointed strongly to Louis de Bourbon-Condé, the young Duc d'Enghien, who was then at Ettenheim, across the Rhine from the French border. D'Enghien had given hostages to Fortune by writing a note to another British secret agent, affirming his willingness to serve under the British flag and referring to the French people as his most cruel enemy. Fouche had a copy of a letter in which D'Enghien claimed to have spent 2 years on the Rhine suborning French troops. Napoleon dearly wanted to arrest Moreau, who had been a thorn in his side for so long, but he feared the effect on public opinion, as the victor of Hohenlinden was still a popular hero. When the police brought in Pichegru and the seriousness of the plot could not be gainsaid, Napoleon pondered his next step. It was the cynical Talleyrand who suggested that D'Enghien, being so close to the French border, should simply be kidnapped. On the night of the 20th of March 804 a French snatch squad seized the Bourbon prince and brought him back to France. It needs to be emphasized that this was against every canon even of the rudimentary international law that existed at the time. D'Enghien was not a prisoner of war, nor a civil prisoner, nor was he wanted for any crime, and neither had France formally made a demand for his extradition. The abduction was piracy pure and simple. In the shadow of Vincennes on the night of the 20th of March, police captain d'Autencourt interrogated the prisoner, under the general supervision of Fouche's deputy, Pierre Fragnois Riel. The chain of command was supposed to run from the first consul to Murat, as military governor of Paris, and then to Riel, but this clarity was later obfuscated as all parties to the affair denied they were the effective decision-makers. The interrogation, and the later summary trial before a military commission, scarcely provided the proof required for a retrospective justification of the kidnapping. D'Enghien was indicted on 6 counts before a military tribunal, consisting of General Hulin, 5 colonels and a captain, but in reality nothing more than a kangaroo court. The 6 counts were: bearing arms against the French people, offering his services to the English, harboring British agents and giving them the means to spy in France, heading an émigré corps on the French border, trying to foment a revolt in the Strasbourg area, and being one of the ringleaders in a plot against the life of the first consul. D'Enghien did not deny his hostility to the current regime in France. Like all exiled nobles, he had joined an anti-revolutionary crusade and could scarcely have respected himself if he had not done so. But he did deny taking part in a plot and said that he had never even met Pichegru. He ended by requesting a personal interview with Napoleon, which was denied. After a very brief hearing, the military tribunal condemned him to death. Again, it is worth stressing that the tribunal had no juridical credentials. It was an ad hoc body which was not bound by any rules. The accused was not told the exact nature of the charges beyond the generalities in the counts of the indictment. No witnesses were called, no defense was allowed, and there was no possibility of appeal or judicial review, as guaranteed by a 1798 law. At 3 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of March, Dinguien was taken out into the courtyard of the Château de Vincennes and executed by firing squad. 2 months later the other conspirators were disposed of. Their trial began on the 25th of May, but almost immediately Pichegru was found to have hanged himself in his cell. On the 25th of June 12 Chouans were executed as ringleaders in the plot. All aristocratic conspirators were pardoned and Morau exiled. It hardly needs to be added that Bernadotte had been in on the whole project and was once again pardoned for Désirée's sake. The plot, which definitely existed, had been a shambles from the very beginning. The plotters were poor at planning and had not taken public opinion into account. In fact, at this juncture there was no significant discontent against the regime, as both unemployment and the price of bread were low. Morau ineptly played into Napoleon's hands. His banishment left the army nowhere to go but into Napoleon's pocket. The execution of the Due Dinguien caused hardly a murmur in France at the time, but, as the Bonaparte women saw clearly, it was an irremovable stain on Napoleon's escutcheon and has come back to sully his name ever since. Josephine pleaded with Napoleon for mercy for the young Bourbon, but he contemptuously dismissed this as a woman's weakness. Laetitia told him bluntly that the execution of Dinguien would be ascribed to his Corsican barbarism and bloodlust and that his reputation would suffer accordingly. The truth of the affair seems to be that Cadaudel and Pichegru took the prince's name in vain, that, although a deadly enemy of the regime, he had never been involved in a plot to assassinate Napoleon. In the opinion of his enemies and of later critics, Napoleon joined the regicides by this brutal and unnecessary murder of an unimportant enemy. So what were his motives and how do we assess his moral stature as a result? Napoleon himself mostly tried to brazen the scandal out and remained unrepentant even on St. Helena. On the 27th of March 1804 he said to Le Couteulx de Canteloup, one of the leading senators, "The circumstances we found ourselves in did not allow chivalry or mercy. If we acted like this habitually in affairs of state, people would legitimately call us puerile." 17 years later, in his last testament on St. Helena, he said he regretted nothing, as the security, interests and honor of the French people were at stake. Yet there is evidence that Napoleon, possibly after listening to the entreaties of Josephine, realized how the affair might be perceived by posterity, and accordingly prepared for himself a Machiavellian alibi. On the one hand, he sent an express to Murat via his aide René Savary ordering him to make an end of everything that very night. On the other, he composed a note for Riel, asking him to hold Dinguien over for further questioning. This note was written at 5 p.m. on the 20th of March but not sent until 10 p.m. Riel was asleep when the courier arrived and did not open the letter of reprieve until it was too late. It was the scenario famously described in Richard, but he, poor man, by your first order died, and that a winged Mercury did bear, some tardy cripple bore the countermand, that came too lag to see him buried. Although Napoleon cannot evade the ultimate responsibility for an act of piracy and murder, he was singularly ill-served on this occasion by all his henchmen. He later claimed that even as he hesitated, Murat lost his head and spent the day panicking over imminent Bourbon counter-revolution. And, despite his later denials, Talleyrand was deeply involved in the assassination, for that is the only appropriate word. It was on his advice that the snatch squad was dispatched. Most of all, the evil genius of Fouché can be detected. Fouché's aim was to show the first consul that his police force was indispensable, and needed to be granted new powers and new funds. In a new terror he would be the effective Robespierre. Savary, too, colluded to rush through the execution and overruled a 24-hour delay in executing sentence asked for by the president of the military tribunal, General Quillan. Napoleon's critics accuse him of playing up the Dinguien affair so as to ascend the imperial throne more easily. Tolstoy even alleged in War and Peace that there was a pathological element in Napoleon's treatment of Dinguien. Tolstoy's story was that the first consul and Dinguien at one time both shared the concurrent favors of mild George, and that Dinguien used to make frequent clandestine trips to Paris to see her. According to the story, on one occasion he found Napoleon in her boudoir at the mercy of one of his fainting fits and could have killed him as he lay helpless. His murder was the thanks he got for his magnanimity. However, this argument is weak in that Napoleon did not need Dinguien for his imperial purposes. He had what he needed in the genuine Cadaudel, Pichegru plot. As he himself said, if he were a convinced regicide he had had many chances, and would have many more. If it was his policy to kill Bourbons he could have had Louis XVIII, and his kinsmen the Comte de Lille and the Comte d'Artois assassinated with ease, and the same was the case when Ferdinand and Don Carlos of Spain were at Valen-les-Ardennes, INR 808. He claimed that several hitmen had approached him over the years, asking for sums of 2 millions to eliminate his political opponents, but he always refused on principle. Part of this argument may be allowed to stand. He was not in the Grand League of Regicides. He had not overthrown the house of Saul like David, overturned the Roman Republic like Caesar, executed a Stuart king like Cromwell, or a Bourbon monarch like the men of '93. Clearly Napoleon was in no sense a killer of princes or collector of Bourbon scalps, and he had Dinguien executed for misperceived reasons of state. There was a conspiracy and there were British intrigues that called for a vigorous riposte, but Napoleon's murder of Dinguien was actually irrelevant to these rational aims. But, like all men, Napoleon was convinced that he never performed an evil action, and once declared, "I am not at bottom a bad sort." However, there can be no denying that Napoleon used the Pichegru, cat-owl plot, regardless of the reality of Dinguien's actual involvement, to become emperor. If he established a dynasty with hereditary succession, it would be pointless in the future for royalists to try to kill him. Moreover, the royalists in exile were genuinely cowed and terrified by Bonaparte's ruthless action against their prince. If the Concordat had given comfort to the right, the events of March R804 silenced the out-free Republicans who had suspected Napoleon of being soft on Bourbon aspirations. It also reassured the notables and the Thermidorians, all who had done well from the sale of national property, that their property and prosperity was safe with Napoleon, had he not now joined them in the ranks of the regicides. By becoming emperor he had decisively rebutted the Jacobin canard that his role was to be that of general monk to the restored king. He convinced both Jacobins and bourgeoisie that there could be no going back to 1789 and therefore that their interests were secure. The gains made by the revolution were irreversible. Even the doomed cat-owl realized he had played into Napoleon's hands. He remarked gloomily, "I came to make a king and instead I have made an emperor." In May 1, 804, in the wake of general indignation about the plot, the Senate proposed that Napoleon be made hereditary emperor of the French. On the 4th of May the necessary ratification took place, and 10 days later a new 142-article constitution was published, which allowed Bonaparte to nominate his successor as emperor. Although Carnot was the only one to oppose this publicly, many of Napoleon's adherents and so-called supporters expressed doubts. Junot, an ardent Republican, is said to have wept at the news. The response of the opposition was more predictable. Lafayette, who had fought a king in America, now found an emperor in his native land, while Germain de Stade remarked disparagingly, for a man who had risen above every throne, to come down willingly to take his place amongst the kings. Even more famous disillusionment was voiced abroad by those who had seen Napoleon as a radical figure. Byron was sadly disappointed, while Beethoven tore up his initial dedication of the Eroica Symphony. Others predicted that everlasting war in Europe would follow as Napoleon would be bound to go in search of fresh thrones for his brothers. Only Fouché, inveterate foe of the Bourbons, seemed enthusiastic about the idea. As for his bickering siblings, Napoleon remarked sarcastically at dinner on the evening of his proclamation as emperor, "To hear my sisters, you'd think I'd done them out of the patrimony my father left them." A third plebiscite was held, this time to confirm Napoleon as emperor. On the 6th of November 1804 the result was announced, 3,572,329 yeses and 2,569 noes. Napoleon could now nominate a successor by adoption from nephews or grand-nephews if he chose, but, since he had no sons, he began by making Joseph heir apparent. With Louis next in line, Lucien and Jérôme were currently in disgrace. Joseph and Louis were made princes of the empire, at a salary of 1,000,000 francs a year, and in addition they received an annual 1/3 of 1,000,000 francs in expenses arising from these posts. On the 18th of May it was announced that the wives of Joseph and Louis would be created princesses, and addressed as Your Royal Highness. Predictably, this was construed as an insult by the Bonaparte sisters. Elissa and Caroline, furious that they were without titles, sulked and threw tantrums. Following a ludicrous opera bouffe scene thrown by Caroline, complete with fainting fit, Napoleon relented and granted them the title of princess. Laetitia too wanted a title but was so outraged by Madame Mère de Sa Majesté l'Empereur that she boycotted the imperial coronation in pique. It was evident that now, above all, the turbulent Bonaparte family was a thorn in the emperor's side. Essentially the reason Lucien and Jérôme were in disgrace was that they had married without their brother's consent. Napoleon suggested to Lucien a dynastic marriage with the widowed Queen of Etruria, but Lucien would have none of it. He obtained the senatorship of Treves with a salary of 25,000 francs together with the castle of Popelsdorf on the Moselle, which had its own theatre and art gallery. Lucien then went on a spending spree, piling up debt, to fill the gallery with Flemish old masters, but he refused the lucrative office of treasurer to the Senate so as not to impair his rights to the consular succession. On the 26th of October R803, without consulting Napoleon, he married the widow of a bankrupt speculator, Madame Alexandrine Jauberchuin. Napoleon exploded with rage at this blatant act of defiance and tried to enlist Laetitia on his side to give Lucien a dressing down, but she sided with her perennial favorite, causing coolness between First Consul and Mother. It was this, as much as anything, that lay behind the formal title Madame Mir awarded at the time of the imperial proclamation. Insult was added to injury when Madame Mir said that as Napoleon had not consulted the Bonaparte family about his marriage to Josephine, the same rule should hold good for his siblings. The imbroglio ended in a slanging match between the two brothers, after which Lucien stormed off to travel privately in Italy and Switzerland. He told Joseph he hated Napoleon and would never forgive him. According to one colorful version of the altercation between the brothers, Napoleon upbraided Lucien for marrying a whore, to which he replied forcefully, "At least my whore is pretty." It was Lucien, too, who was most assiduous in spreading the rumor that Napoleon had slept with Hortense de Beauharnais and that Louis's son was really Napoleon's. Jerome meanwhile gave offense in even more spectacular fashion. When war broke out again, Jerome deserted his ship in the West Indies and made his way to the United States. There, as described above, he met and, on Christmas Eve R803, married a Baltimore beauty, Betsy Patterson, the daughter of a wealthy shipowner. Husband and pregnant wife soon took ship for Holland, to find that the empire had been declared and that a woman named Patterson was not to be allowed to land on French soil, or that of its allies. The weak-livered Jerome, faced with a choice between his wife or power and fortune, chose the latter. On a promise of a kingdom, he agreed to have his marriage annulled by one of the complicated provisions of the Concordat, allowing France to set up an officiality of Paris. The luckless Betsy Patterson found sanctuary in England, where she gave birth to a son and was feted as a propaganda trophy, an example of what happened to those who trusted the Bonapartes. Yet the most troublesome aspect of the Bonaparte family was their hatred of Josephine, and their constant meddling in matters that had nothing to do with them. Instead of being stupefied with gratitude that their brilliant brother had raised them from poverty and obscurity to unimaginable heights of wealth and power, the Bonapartes seemed to take the line that this was their due anyway, and that the natural order of things, previously distorted by untoward circumstance, had now reasserted itself. Their unrelenting hostility towards Josephine, who requited it with a dangerous alliance with Fouche, was actually counterproductive, for it nudged Napoleon closer to an official declaration that Josephine would be empress, something he had pondered long and hard. Fury at the impudence of his family in presuming to dictate to him about Josephine was one motive in making him decide to proclaim her as an imperial consort. Another was simple human decency, not a quality usually associated with Napoleon. He told Roederer, "My wife is a good woman, happy to play the role of the empress, with diamonds and fine clothes. I've never loved her blindly. If I've made her empress, it's out of a sense of justice. I am above all a just man. If I'd been thrown into prison instead of becoming emperor, she would have shared my misfortunes. It's only right she should share my greatness. People are jealous of Josephine, of Eugene and of Hortense." There was further dithering about whether Josephine would actually be crowned. Here the problem was that the empress had dared to throw jealous scenes about Napoleon's numerous amours. By this time everyone was thrusting wives, daughters and sweethearts at him. It was known that he gave douceurs of zero francs a night to those he spent the night with. Some women, hearing that he was highly sexed and with an insatiable appetite, went in for orgies and sexual perversions with members of his entourage, hoping he would hear about it and be lured by the lubricious attractions on offer. They misread their man. Napoleon was not a sexual extrovert, and he disapproved of women acting in a loose way unless he personally had commanded it. Nevertheless, there were mistresses aplenty. In 1804, while on tour in the Rhineland, he had a brief affair with one of Josephine's ladies-in-waiting named Elizabeth de Vaudy. Josephine was able to scotch that particular liaison, but she had less power in Paris, where for a while Napoleon had a love nest in the Rue de Vence. Here he fornicated and cuckolded with gusto until a particular incident made him rethink his amatory strategy. Slipping on the snow outside his secret trysting place one day, he caught the ironic gleam in his sentry's eye and realized that he was making a fool of himself in the eyes of his beloved Grand Army. Thereafter he decided to confine himself to a circle of court héterie. The snag about infidelity at St. Cloud was that it was too close to Josephine for comfort. A more serious and long-term amatory adventure produced a succession of tempestuous rows in the palace. The Murats, insanely jealous of the continuing favor he showed Josephine, devoted themselves to finding women who might displace her in the emperor's affections. For a time Adele Duchâtel seemed the answer to their prayers. Madame Duchâtel was a 20-year-old beauty, separated or divorced. It is not clear which, from the middle-aged Director General of Records. Napoleon took the bait and Murat provided cover by pretending to be madly in love with Adele. But Josephine was not fooled. A game of cat and mouse developed between emperor and empress. Josephine found out about the affair from her spies and tried to maintain surveillance on her husband in the palace, but he outfoxed her by creeping along to his mistress's room in his bare feet. Noticing her husband paying unwanted attention to La Duchâtel at a party, Josephine next day summoned Madame Junot, who had been near the couple, to find out what had transpired. Laura Junot claimed that she and the emperor had recently gone to bed together, and that Napoleon had been as ardent as a young lieutenant. The arrival of her lover cut short the narration and, seeing Napoleon, Madame Junot hastily took her leave. Josephine repeated the substance of what her visitor had said, which sparked off a tremendous row. Napoleon ended it by saying he was the emperor, and no one should presume to give him laws or tell him what to do. He then smashed several plates, broke a water jug, tore a tablecloth and stormed out. Yet Josephine could not be so easily swayed from her purposes. Her sights were set on Adele Duchadel. One evening at St. Cloud she saw Duchadel leave the drawing room and noticed that the emperor was no longer present. She left the room and came back half an hour later in a state of high agitation to tell Claire de Remusat what she had discovered. She had gone up the private staircase to Napoleon's bedroom and heard Adele's voice inside. She demanded to be let in and, when Napoleon finally opened the door, she found him and Duchadel in an advanced state of undress. The sequel was more outrageous than any jealous scene hitherto. Napoleon came storming back to the drawing room, causing all his guests to decamp for Paris in terror. He began by smashing up the furniture in rage, then told Josephine to leave St. Cloud immediately, as he was tired of being spied on by a jealous woman who could not give him children. The story made the rounds of Paris. One wag remarked that the emperor had neglected the campaign against England in order to smash Chinese vases in the empress's bedroom. As it happened, Josephine had panicked and overreacted, possibly even giving the affair a new lease of life. Although the affair with Duchadel dragged on from late 1803 to early 1806, she was often a concurrent mistress with several others. Duchadel was scarcely his kind of woman. Despite being attractive and intelligent and able to play to perfection the part of the coquette, Duchadel was at heart a cold and haughty woman, who gradually revealed the frightening scale of her ambition. If Madame de Remusat can be believed, matters actually reached the stage in the end where Napoleon asked Josephine's advice on how to get rid of her. It was a pleasing characteristic of Josephine's that she was never vindictive. Once she realized she had nothing to fear from her rival, she ceased to be angry and even kept Adele on in her service. Duchadel herself always remained loyal to Napoleon, even when fair-weather friends deserted him. Napoleon, characteristically, repaid her loyalty with slights and insults, cut her in public and refused to speak to her again. In short, he behaved like the classical cad. Meanwhile, however, in the short term Josephine was in deep disgrace. Too late she realized she had carried things too far. Faced with disgrace, she implored Hortense to use her well-known influence on Napoleon on her behalf, but Hortense cried off, on the grounds that Louis had forbidden her ever to interfere in his brother's affairs. Eugene de Beauharnais also refused to face the emperor's wrath, though when Napoleon told him he was thinking seriously of divorcing Josephine, he elected to follow her into exile rather than accept dukedoms and fortunes from his stepfather. The moral contrast with Jerome could hardly be clearer. It seems that it was his family's gloating triumphalism over the supposed imminent demise of Josephine that swung Napoleon back towards forgiveness. After further soul-searching, he told Roeder he intended to see her crowned. "Yes, she will be crowned, even if it should cost me 200,000 men," he declared in a typically melodramatic flourish. So Napoleon made final plans for his coronation. It was important to him that the Pope should come from Rome to officiate, for this would carry overtones of Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire, aside from convincing royalists and peasantry that the Concordat was holding and that the empire would be a Catholic empire. Napoleon's correspondence for this period is full of letters about the necessity for the Pope's attendance and the protocol to be observed on his arrival. Pius VII was wary and did not accept the invitation without a great deal of heart-searching. Finally, Caprara, the papal nuncio to France, persuaded him of the possible benefits in terms of fresh religious concessions from the new emperor. But it must be realized that Caprara was a slavish creature of Napoleon, who took his cue from Bonaparte rather than the papacy. So the Pope made the famous journey. He arrived at Fontainebleau on the 25th of November, where Napoleon met him. Then after 3 days of entertainment, emperor and pontiff proceeded to Paris. Right until the last moment, Napoleon continued to be plagued by his women. On the 17th of November there was a violent scene when the emperor told his sisters they would be expected to carry the empress's train. Then Josephine decided that she could hardly be crowned by the Pope if she had not been properly married in the eyes of Holy Mother Church. Actually, this was a transparent ploy to make it harder for the emperor to divorce her. Napoleon, cynical as ever, always had it in mid to divorce Josephine when he found it convenient, and was undeterred by the idea of a religious ceremony to solemnize his marriage. So, towards midnight on the first day of December, before an altar erected in the emperor's study, Cardinal Fesch, who had come with Pius from Rome, conducted a brief marriage service. Josephine was satisfied, but in strictly legal terms her status was no more solid than before, since the service was not attended by witnesses and the regular parish priest was absent. For Napoleon, the 1st of December was far more important as the day when a senatus consultum established the legitimacy of the succession, and the rights of his brothers to succeed if he died without issue. Coronation Day was the 2nd of December R 804. A recent snowfall followed by rain left the city streets slush-ridden. 3 rows of troops lined the route, crowds clustered behind them but seemed more curious than enthusiastic. First out of the Tuileries, at 9 a.m., was the Pope, escorted by 4 squadrons of dragoons and followed by 6 carriages full of cardinals and assorted clergy. It was observed that the crowd split about 50-50 in its reaction. The pious dropped to their knees and made the sign of the cross, while the Jacobin sympathizers defiantly declined to doff their hats. Then came the secular carriages, driven at breakneck speed through the streets through fear of assassins. Murat led the way, followed by ministers, councillors of state, the diplomatic corps and the sullen Bonaparte princesses. Napoleon made a very late start. Although the Empress's ladies-in-waiting had been ready since 6 a.m., the Emperor himself made a leisurely toilette. Before leaving the Tuileries at Rho a.m., Napoleon took Joseph by the arm, pointed at the 2 of them in the mirror and said, "Joseph, if only our father could see us." Then the imperial couple set out for Notre Dame Cathedral in a sumptuous coach of glass and gilt, with 7 wide windows and 4 eagles on the roof bearing a crown. All that sumptuary extravagance could do had been done. The emperor had decided on a predominant bee motif, as the emblem of the new empire was to be stars, bees and laurel leaves in relief. Napoleon wore a purple velvet coat with a white and gold silk sash, and a short purple cloak embroidered with golden bees. The ensemble was topped off with a floppy 17th-century hat with turned-up brim, ostrich plumes and a plethora of diamonds. Josephine donned a gown of white satin embroidered with bees and a court mantle of purple velvet. She was ablaze with diamonds, in her tiara, her necklace, earrings and belt. The entire court was dressed in velvet cloaks embroidered in gold and silver. Just before entering Notre Dame, Napoleon put on a huge cloak of purple velvet, lined with ermine and embroidered with his motif of golden bees. On his head he had a wreath of gold laurel leaves, to make him appear like the portrait of an emperor on a Roman coin. Like most successful dictators, Napoleon was alive to the importance of pictorial imagery, symbolism and iconography, but his short stature was ill-suited to the multicolored finery, and one wag said that the emperor most resembled the king of diamonds in a pack of cards. Just as his coach arrived at Notre Dame, the sun came out from behind the clouds. Always sensitive to signs and portents, Napoleon claimed this was a good omen. As he and Josephine stepped out of the carriage, cannon roared and bells pealed. They entered the cathedral after a further unconscionable delay, each under a canopy and followed by a procession. Pius VII, who had had to endure a wait of several hours in a freezing cathedral, began to intone the Mass. He anointed Napoleon's head, arms and hands in accordance with the ancient tradition that, since Clovis in 496, all monarchs of France should undergo this ritual. Next, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head. He then crowned Josephine, who burst into tears. This self-crowning, one of the most famous of all Napoleonic gestures, has been much misunderstood. It was not an act of spontaneous improvisation or a calculated snub to the Pope, as in the legend, but a carefully rehearsed matter of protocol which had already been discussed with the Pope at great length. The personal crowning of Josephine which occasioned her tears is more problematical, for that gesture can be interpreted variously, as caprice, love or political maneuver. Having completed the Mass, which climaxed with a singing of Vivat Imperator in Eternum, the Pope then withdrew, leaving the principals to administer the imperial oath, designed to counterbalance the religious ceremony and satisfy the scruples of former revolutionaries. Meticulous care had been taken to see that nothing about the coronation ceremony could cause laughter, or ridicule or give rise to jokes, lampoons or scurrilous cartoons. But once again Napoleon's best-laid plans were nearly undone by his family. At one point in the proceedings there was a near affray at the altar between Josephine and her sisters-in-law who were supposed to be carrying the train. Pauline and Caroline were the culprits, and Napoleon had to hiss some words of ferocious warning at them before they desisted. The wording of the oath is interesting, revealing as it does the mixture of motives animating Napoleon's supporters and representing the apotheoses of revolutionary principles. I swear to uphold the integrity of the Republic's territory, to respect and impose the laws of the Concordat, and religious freedom, to respect and impose the respect of equal rights, political and civil liberties, the irreversibility of the sale of national property, to raise no duty and to establish no tax except through the law, to uphold the institution of the Legion of Honor, to rule only in the interests of the happiness and glory of the French people. If we disregard the bromides and the pious obeisance to vague principles, we are left with only one solid idea, that the sale of national property was sacrosanct.